Welcome to Descendants of the Imagination. And it's my privilege today to have a conversation with Gary Young, who is a poet and artist and a printer, lots of other things too, as we'll discover during our conversation.
The environment has informed my poems just because I've been here for so long. I've lived here in Bonnie Doon now for almost 35 years. All the structures, I built my studio, the house, it's like, so it's very much a part of me. And so my poems reflect that. And I lived in New York City when our oldest boy was 2. I taught there for a semester. I wrote poems about New York City. So wherever I am, I was in Japan working on a book of translations. I wrote, a number of poems that deal with Japan. But I've been here for a long time. This is home. This is where my children were born and raised, and so it's, I just feel completely connected to it. It gives me the images I use in my poems, and the ideas, the concerns, philosophical problems that I might deal with in a poem always comes wrapped up in the stream that runs by my house, or the trees, or the weather. No ideas, but in things in my life are primarily the objects that you encounter in the woods. It's like geology. This is the lowest layer of the poem. Usually, almost always a little random note. I get an idea or I see something and I do that, and then once I finally have enough to make a draft, then I pass the first draft, and then just keep working on it. I'm old school when it comes to poetry. I believe that poems are something that you construct, and the trick, of course, is to make them look like you haven't worked on them. It just came out that way. So I don't know, there's usually on this couple of drafts and then changes and changes. I tend to work in red because I can see it better. But again, it's just trying out different tenses, different forms. We harvested the persimmons we could reach and left what remained for the birds. Juncos, warblers, and winter wrens buried themselves in the fruit, gorged on the pulp until nothing was left but empty skin, prayer flags stuttering in the wind. Now the birds cry out from the highest branches of the tree, while at the foot of the mountain, children are singing in a bright room where their friend, my student, a sweet red-headed boy, is dying.
One of the marks of your poems, they're short. They're very to the point.
Pretty short.
Yeah.
And most of the longer ones I wish were shorter.
What is the longest poem that you've written?
Goodness, I have some poems in my first couple of books that go a couple of pages. They're long narrative poems, but what attracts me to a poem is brevity and concision, and there's not a poem that can't be made better by making it shorter. Until finally you get to the point where, okay, we can't cut anything else out of here.
What's the longest you've ever, let me say, worked on a poem? You write it, first draft, you set it aside, you come back to it, and before you figure, okay, it's ready to share with the world, it's as good as I can get it. What's the longest that's ever?
I've had poems that stayed in my Poems in Progress folder for years, and I couldn't finish them. I mean, I've had a couple, actually in the book that I'm working on now. It's a book called That's What I Thought, and I have a couple of poems that I got close, and I couldn't finish them. And it was wonderful coming back after so much time. It was like a new poem. It was actually like, it was more like helping someone write their poem. Everything that was in my head at the time had kind of gone away. All I had was this raw material. And, you know, like most poets, I send my work to friends, and they send their work to me, and it's so much easier to edit somebody else's work than your own. But when years had gone by, my poem was like someone else's.
There's a poem that you had sent to me that I don't remember having read before, the one about in the woods hunting mushrooms.
That's a new poem from this new
Oh, no
this
wonder
new
I
book.
don't remember it.
Would you like me to read that one?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Would you read that poem, please? It doesn't have a name, so I can't name it for you.
Mm-hmm. I live in Bonnie Doon, and I do a lot of mushroom hunting, and I love to eat mushrooms. Now, I have a lot of mushroom poems. But I tend to hunt in the same places. Like most people, I have my spots. Not that I would tell you.
Yeah,
or anyone.
You don't share that with people.
No,
I've learned that.
You don't do that. But this is a poem about that experience. In the woods, hunting mushrooms, I saw a flash of white and thought, Amanita, death cap, but it was just a piece of paper. When I picked it up, I recognized my own handwriting. It was a note I must have written months before and dropped. Waterlogged and half-eaten by slugs, the ink was faded, but I could read, the willingness to use our minds is what erodes our minds.
So whatever we use tends to wear out, right?
It's the willingness to do it, not the doing it. It's the willingness to do it.
That erodes
That
our
erodes
minds.
our minds.
All right, expatiate, please.
That we would, it's the willfulness. The doing does not erode our minds. That expands our minds and our lives. It's that willingness to succumb to ego or whatever it is that might be pulling us in that direction.
All right, I'm
that's,
getting it.
That's corrosive.
Okay.
And that's what I was getting at in the poem. And that's, I mean, finding this note, what the hell did it mean? I don't know. Except that I found it, it meant something. It didn't mean anything until I found it again months after I had dropped it in the woods.
So again, this is a poem that in fact issued from an actual experience.
Virtually every one of my poems is.
Really?
Yes, I don't invent anything. I don't have enough of imagination to do that.
Oh yeah, right.
I'm serious. Invention, my poetic project, such as it is really just to try to make sense of my place in the world. And it's not solipsism so much as it just is, that's what I've got. And poetry is my vehicle for trying to enter into my own experience, which, as this poem sort of alludes to, I'm oblivious to half the time, as most of us are. We do things, we don't know why we do it. Things happen to us, we miss them. We don't recognize their significance. And so writing poetry is a way of trying to make sense of that. And so a lot of times I'll be talking in my poems about things that happen. People bursting into flames, for instance, people getting hit by lightning. But they really got hit by lightning and they really burst into flames. So no, I really, there's virtually no invention in my poems.
It's almost a cliche between you and I about this one particular poem that I either hope that I will hear you read or I outright ask you to read all the time. Would you mind at least this one more time reading that poem for me?
When you told me to have a couple of poems ready, I figured it wouldn't be right if I didn't read this one because I know it's one of your favorites.
It's not just one of my favorites of your poems, it's one of my all-time favorite poems in the world.
This is an untitled prose poem. In fact, the poems in my first couple of books, most of which were lineated, have titles, but my last 6 books, the poems have not been titled and are all prose poems. So. 2 girls were struck by lightning at the harbor mouth. An orange flame lifted them up and laid them down again. Their thin suits had been melted away. It's a miracle they survived. It's a miracle they were ever born at all.
I've been asking myself for many years why I love the poem so much. And I've pretty much decided I don't want to figure out why I love it so much, but I do every time I hear it. However, today, as I was looking at it, I realized something that I hadn't realized before, and that is the 2 girls struck by lightning. That's kind of a variation on your interest in spontaneous human combustion, and it never occurred to me before. But it's probably occurred to you a million times.
Well, that's one of the things that attracted me to the event.
Ah, I see. Have you written any other poems about spontaneous human combustion?
Well, I have a poem about spontaneous human combustion, and I have the girls bursting into flame. I have the girls getting hit by lightning.
I have to admit to you, I have this resistance to the notion that one can spontaneously burst into flames, and yet I know that you truly, if I say that you truly believe it, it sounds like but there's something that in me that fights against that notion. How much do you know about this bursting into flames business?
More than I should.
More than you should? Have you done a lot of research on it?
I have done a lot of research on it. And I correspond with Arnold, who wrote Blaze. He's the chief investigator of human spontaneous combustion.
Oh?
You may have seen him on weird science programs.
No.
and the lot. But anyway, no, it's, I don't know why people find that so odd. You've been in love, haven't you?
Yeah.
What's so odd about people bursting into flame?
Gosh,
I mean,
now
it's
that
the
you
same.
put it that
It's
way.
the same thing. I flew to New York last month. I was sitting in a chair,
Yeah.
and I
Okay.
got there in 6 hours.
No,
Never
I know.
got out
I know.
of the chair.
I know. I have
People burst into flame. Gosh, that's hard to believe.
Okay. All right. No, I'm with you on the flying business. I still can't quite believe
It's
it.
all a mystery.
I asked Gary if he would give me a short bio, and so let me refer to a few of the things in here. My goodness, it says here, Gary, that you have won prize honors from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the California Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, Poetry Society. You know, I know some of this stuff. You've won 3 major prizes from the Poetry Society of America, which is pretty darn amazing. And I would guess that the William Carlos Williams Award would be the one that you might be the fondest of. Is that right?
Yeah, it was for the best book of the year for a university or private press.
So this was the first press I had, and I used to do sometimes 8,000-10,000 impressions a day off this thing. So I was young and I was skinny, and this kept me skinny. This is my baby. I love all my presses. I love this one more. It's
How old did you say it was?
This is about my age. This was probably made in about 1950. It's very, very large. You can print an enormous piece of paper, and you can fill the bed with a woodcut or type or with whatever you want to do. And paper goes up here. You set it on this. I love making prints and doing woodcuts. This is where I do my woodcuts here. There's one in the press right there. I like the meditative aspect of cutting wood. And the nice thing about wood, that's what I always tell my students, is that wood and ink have an affinity. When you put them together, you get beautiful things. So, yeah, it's again the cutting and then the printing of a wood block is pretty special.
Do you have any memories about any of these presses that stand out? A particular work or a particular incident?
It seems to me that every job is the same job. I love being on these machines. I love printing. And you see there's books everywhere that I've printed in here. And when I finish a book, I just want to go on and print another book. And so yeah, it's just being on the presses. It's, I imagine it's like surfing or riding a bike to people that do that and love it. You might think about that one wave, or you might think about that one great descent, but really all you're thinking about is riding a bike or surfing or printing. It's all the same job. Geography of Home, a book that I did with Gene Holton and Elizabeth Sanchez, definitely stands out. It's a major book, and it was a joy to do working with them. And Mallarmé's Un Coup de Day is a book that stands out. I was the first person to print the book in the format that Mallarmé specified. I had the proof pages that Mallarmé had gone over when Vollard, the great publisher in France of artist books in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was his first book. And, it was abandoned. The printer refused to print it. Mallarmé died, and I got the proofs out of the Houghton Library and printed the book. And it's one of those books that you're really happy to have done. I would never want to print it again. It was madness.
Why?
Oh, because it's so demanding. And it just took so long. And it was one of those books that if I had waited 3 years to print it, I could have done all of the work on computer and saved myself a lot of time and printed from plates. But I did it all from hot metal, set it by hand. It was just a very difficult job.
What makes that page so interesting?
Well, all these things relate to pieces inside the poem. You can read this book across, down. You can read just the 18-point italic. You can read just this large italic. You can read simply the words that are in caps. And so there's many different ways to read this book. And in fact, what I realized in the 2 years it took me to print this book is that Mallarmé had really just created an engine of contingencies. All of these patterns get broken. They get established and he breaks them very, very subtly. But then they come back, they recur. And so this book can be read, every time you read it, you're reading a different book.
Did you apprentice with anyone?
I took a class at the high school after I got out of graduate
Just
school.
like setting type and all
Just
that?
the basics, and then I just read, and then I started talking to all the old printers in town, and then I was lucky to meet Gene Holton, who one of the top illustrators in the country for years and years, and decided that he always wanted to be a printer because he'd been doing illustrations for Saul Marks and some of the other great printers down in LA. So we moved up here and we met in the night school
Wow.
printing class. He taught me everything I know about typography. I mean, he definitely, he taught me just by talking.
You have a poem about Jean and Elizabeth. Would you mind reading that?
Some of the most delightful hours in my life were spent in their company.
Yeah.
And in addition to being a great artist, Elizabeth was a fantastic cook. And she refused to make the same dish twice.
Oh my.
And it was not an inhibition to her. So here's a poem about that. Elizabeth fed me. Pasta with anchovies, lentils with sage, always a different dish. Jean talked about love nests, the prairie in winter, and how once as a child he determined he was God. We sat at a table and looked out at a ginkgo and a locust, and in spring a crabapple blossomed beneath the upstairs window. There were paintings on every wall, ceramics on every shelf, and flowers, orchids, zinnias, asters. Elizabeth once made a salad with spinach, walnuts, blue cheese, and pear. Then she picked a daylily from a bouquet on the counter, chopped it, and sprinkled it over the greens. We spent years that way, feasting on the world.
Listen, I don't want to run out of time before I ask you about something that you and I have both had experience with, and that is the poetry show that is on KUSP, and it's been on KUSP for over 38 years now. And I know that you and Steve Kessler actually gave the poetry show its name, and you inherited its nascent beginnings from a couple of folks who were at the station prior to your taking over. But you did it for 10 years, didn't you?
Yeah, and then actually a little more because we did Bards After Dark too for a while.
Oh, I never caught that. Holy cow.
It was too late. It was when they moved the show to a later time, and I live in Bonnie Doon. Stephen was living out in Soquel at that time, and it was just too much commuting. But yeah, there were two young women, and I can't for the life of me remember their names. They didn't do it for very long, and they had a show called Striking the Dark Air for Music, which is taken from a William Pitt Root
Yes.
poem, and I believe a book of the same name. And it wasn't the same format that we have grown to know and love.
Right.
But they did get on, and they read poetry, and they talked about poetry with each other, and then they went off. I think they must have been students, because I think they graduated, and they weren't there for very long. And
they went to New Orleans, did they not?
Someplace, yeah.
Yeah.
And then
so.
Stephen and I took it over, and we did it for a long time until you and Morton Marcus took it over.
No, actually,
Oh,
Joe
Joe
Stroud
that's right,
and Morton Marcus
that's
did it.
right.
And then Joe...
and Joe left, and you
Joe asked me if I'd cover for him, and I've been doing it for 18 years now. So.
cover for me. I'll be back in 20 years.
But it's pretty amazing that it is the oldest poetry program on radio in the country.
Yeah.
I remember I wanted to know what the oldest one was in other countries. So I called a radio station in Ireland. I figured in Dublin, which is known for its poetry, that they'd be able to tell me something. And I said, "How many poetry shows are there in Ireland?" And I think we have to hurry here. I'm getting a hand signal. I don't know how many minutes that means, but it means 5 minutes. Okay, so we've got time for more poems. Anyway, I said, "How many poetry shows are there in Ireland?" That was just the first part of my question. He said, "Geez, I don't know, but there are 5 on our station." Five poetry
That's
shows.
wonderful.
Yes,
That's
gosh,
good to
and I
know.
never did get around to asking him what the oldest one was. But so you and Stephen actually basically started the poetry show, and it's been called the Poetry Show for 38 years, and it's pretty amazing to be a part of it. We've got to leave here soon. So would you read a poem or two of your choice from your new book, or?
Well, I got one more from the new
okay.
book. I'll go ahead and read that.
Which one's that?
All That's Left of the Fabled Residents. I went to Japan 3 years ago and worked on some translations from the Japanese. I have designed a book of calligraphy by Koban Aragawa, who was a Zen priest. And I was there working with several people, mostly Zenists, and a Buddhist scholar from Kyoto University on the translations. And I wrote several poems of my own while I was there, so this is one. All that's left of the fabled residence is a tea house on a tiny island in the center of a pond. The great hall must have been beautiful. The little house and the bridge beside it are lovely even now. Wisteria sways along a trellis that rises from the pond, and 3 turtles rest on a rock beside a slender crane. The water is marked with the dark shadows of cedar and pine, and enormous carp circle the pond endlessly, without knowing they're in a pond, without knowing that they're carp.
Well, there's
no
time
mind to erode.
There's time for in Western Massachusetts, I think.
Oh,
Yeah, I think so.
I'm happy to read it.
All right, and then we'll have to say goodbye for a while.
A friend of mine, a poet whose book I published, Brad Crenshaw,
He's been on the poetry show.
is a neuropsychologist in addition to being a poet, and every once in a while he'll feed me stories of his patients, and I have to be careful that I don't just steal all of them. But this is about one of his patients. In western Massachusetts, a man wandered into the woods to live alone. He tried hunting, but the only animals that stood their ground, the only animals he could catch, were skunks. The man was sprayed, of course, but he caught them, ate them, and dressed in a cloak of rancid pelts. When he was found, the scent was on his breath, his skin, and when I heard his story, I thought, comrade.
So he was still living when he was found because it was on his breath. Well, listen, that's an amazing poem too, but our time is out, so thank you very much for having this conversation.
Always a pleasure, Dennis.